Part 1 at the
Check the
birth of a
undercarriage
terror.
straps. Make sure they're secure.
In the
Yes,
quiet
checking now.
fields
Looks
of
good.
1930s
Good.
Germany,
Now the
long
propeller.
before the
It must
skies
be
of
perfect
Europe
done.
would burn
All
with
clear.
war,
Prepare the
an
cockpit
aircraft
next.
began to take shape that would soon carve its name into the nightmares of soldiers and civilians alike. The aircraft was the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, a machine designed not merely to drop bombs, but to terrify those beneath it. In an era when military strategists were reimagining how wars would be fought, German engineers sought a weapon that could strike with surgical precision while shattering enemy morale. The result was an aircraft whose very sound would become synonymous with impending destruction. The Stuka's origins lay in the radical doctrine of blitzkrieg, the German strategy of lightning war. Blitzkrieg required speed, coordination, and devastating air support. Tanks would advance rapidly across enemy territory, infantry would follow close behind, and above them, dive bombers would eliminate strong points, artillery positions, and defensive lines. For this doctrine to work, Germany needed an aircraft capable of delivering bombs with incredible accuracy, something conventional level bombers struggled to achieve. The Ju-87 answered that call with a brutal simplicity. Its most distinctive feature was its ability to dive steeply toward the Earth, sometimes at angles approaching 90 degrees. As the aircraft plunged downward, the pilot would line up the target through a specialized sight before releasing the bomb at low altitude. This method dramatically improved accuracy, allowing German forces to destroy bridges, bunkers, and tanks with terrifying efficiency. But the Stuka was more than a machine of precision, it was also a psychological weapon. Attached to its landing gear were mechanical sirens known as Jericho Trumpets. As the aircraft screamed downward in a dive, the wind-driven sirens emitted a horrifying wail that echoed across the battlefield. To those on the ground, it sounded like the sky itself was screaming. Soldiers described the sound as a signal of inevitable death, a sound that froze men in their tracks and shattered morale before the bombs even struck. Despite its sinister reputation, the Stuka's design was almost ungainly. Its inverted gull wings, fixed landing gear, and angular fuselage gave it a strange, almost archaic appearance compared to the sleek fighters of the era. Yet beneath that awkward shape was a highly specialized weapon. Built for stability in a dive and ruggedness in combat, the aircraft could endure stresses that would tear apart many others. When Germany began its aggressive expansion across Europe, the Stuka would become the spearhead of aerial terror. Soon, across the skies of Poland, France, and beyond, its terrifying howl would signal the arrival of a new kind of warfare, one where precision, speed, and fear worked together as deadly allies. The legend of the Stuka was about to begin. Part 2 at the Scream of Poland. On the morning of September 1, 1939, the quiet countryside of Eastern Europe erupted into chaos. German forces crossed the border into Poland, unleashing the first campaign of what would soon become World War II. As armored columns rolled across fields and roads, another force descended from above at the Ju-87 Stuka, the airborne hammer of the German war machine. For the first time, the terrifying concept of blitzkrieg unfolded in full force. Tanks surged forward, infantry followed in coordinated waves, and overhead, formations of Stukas circled like predatory birds. When their moment came, the pilots pushed their aircraft into steep dives, engines roaring as gravity pulled them toward their targets. From the ground, the experience was surreal and horrifying. Witnesses later described the moment when the sky suddenly filled with a mechanical scream at the sound of the Jericho trumpets. As the Stukas plunged downward, their sirens howled across villages and battlefields. Civilians ran for cover, soldiers scattered for trenches, and horses bolted in panic. Then the bombs fell. Bridges collapsed onto rivers. Trains exploded in fire. Defensive positions vanished in clouds of earth and smoke. Polish anti-aircraft gunners fired desperately into the sky, but the Stukas were already pulling out of their dives, climbing away to prepare for another attack. What made the Stuka so devastating was its accuracy. Unlike traditional bombers that dropped payloads from high altitude, the dive bombing technique allowed pilots to strike individual targets with astonishing precision. German commanders quickly realized that this capability made the aircraft perfect for destroying infrastructure and clearing the way for advancing ground forces. For the Polish army, the psychological effect was almost as destructive as the bombs themselves. Soldiers reported feeling haunted, knowing that at any moment the sky could open with that dreadful scream. Roads became death traps. Columns of troops could be scattered in seconds by a sudden aerial attack. Yet the Stuka's success also masked its weaknesses. The aircraft was slow and vulnerable to fighter interception. During the Polish campaign, this flaw was not yet obvious because German fighters controlled the skies. But in the months and years ahead, when the Stuka would face stronger air defenses, its limitations would become painfully clear. For now, however, the Ju-87 had proven its terrifying potential. In the opening chapter of World War II, it had demonstrated how air power could shatter an enemy's defenses before the ground battle had even begun. Across Europe, military observers watched closely. Many realized that warfare had entered a new and far more terrifying age. Part 3 and the Hammer of France. By the spring of 1940, the Ju-87 Stuka had become the airborne symbol of German power. When German forces launched their offensive into Western Europe, the aircraft played a central role in the lightning-fast campaign that stunned the world. The invasion would culminate in the decisive Battle of France, one of the most dramatic military collapses in modern history. Once again, the Stuka became the instrument that opened the path for German ground forces. As armored divisions surged through the forests and valleys of the Ardennes, Stuka squadrons targeted bridges, fortifications, and defensive positions. The aircraft appeared wherever resistance formed, plunging from the clouds to break enemy lines. French and British troops soon learned to recognize the distinctive silhouette of the aircraft, the bent wings, the large fixed landing gear, and the black crosses on the wings. But recognition offered little protection. When the Stukas began their dives, the Jericho Trumpets wailed through the sky, sending waves of panic through troops who knew what would follow. Entire convoys were destroyed within minutes. Defensive strongpoints that had taken months to build were reduced to rubble. In one attack after another, the Stukas acted as aerial artillery for German ground units, smashing obstacles that might otherwise slow the advance. One of the most famous uses of the Stuka occurred during the crossing of the Meuse River, where French defenses initially threatened to halt the German advance. Dive bombers attacked repeatedly, hammering bunkers and artillery positions until the defenders were overwhelmed. With the defenses shattered, German forces crossed the river and continued their unstoppable push toward the English Channel. Yet the skies over France also began to reveal the Stuka's vulnerability. When Allied fighter aircraft intercepted the slow dive bombers, losses could be severe. Without escort fighters, the Stuka was easy prey. Even so, during the early stages of the war, the aircraft's effectiveness was undeniable. For German soldiers on the ground, the scream of the Stuka meant help was arriving. For those facing it, the sound meant the opposite. It meant destruction was seconds away. Part 4 The Sky That Fought Back 4. In the summer of 1940, the Ju-87 Stuka met the sky that would challenge its terrifying dominance. After the fall of France, Germany prepared for an invasion of Britain. The plan required the destruction of British defenses, ports, and airfields. Once again, the Stuka was called upon to perform its deadly work. Yet this time, the battlefield would be very different. The campaign that followed would become known as the Battle of Britain, the first major military campaign fought almost entirely in the air. The Stuka, which had performed with devastating effectiveness across continental Europe, now faced an enemy that controlled neither fear nor surrender, the determined pilots of the Royal Air Force. When Stuka formations crossed the English Channel, their mission remained the same: dive on radar stations, harbors, and airfields, destroying the infrastructure that sustained British resistance. At first, the attacks were precise and brutal. Radar towers collapsed under bomb blasts. Ships exploded in ports. Coastal defenses trembled under the screaming descent of the dive bombers. But Britain had something Poland and France had not possessed in the same way: a powerful defensive network. Radar stations detected incoming aircraft long before they reached their targets. Fighter squadrons scrambled from airfields across southern England. Soon, the skies filled with the sleek silhouettes of Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane interceptors racing toward the German formations. The Stuka was not designed to survive fighter combat. Slow, heavy, and built for stable dive attacks rather than aerial maneuvering, it became dangerously vulnerable when confronted by agile enemy fighters. As RAF pilots tore through the German bomber formations, the dive bombers struggled to escape. Within days, the losses became catastrophic. Stukas burned in the skies over the English Channel, spiraling into the sea or crashing across English fields. Entire squadrons suffered devastating casualties. Pilots who had once dominated the skies over Europe now found themselves hunted. The psychological weapon that had terrified soldiers on the ground now faced a new terror: the sudden appearance of enemy fighters slicing through the formation. In those moments, the once feared dive bomber seemed fragile and exposed. German commanders quickly realized the truth. Without complete air superiority, the Stuka could not survive in heavily defended skies. By late August 1940, the aircraft was largely withdrawn from operations over Britain. The scream of the Jericho Trumpets had met a sky that refused to yield. Part 5: At the Eastern Inferno. If the skies over Britain had exposed the Stuka's weakness, the vast battlefields of the Eastern Front would once again reveal its deadly potential. In June 1941, Germany launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union known as Operation Barbarossa. It was the largest military operation in human history, stretching across thousands of kilometers of front lines. Here, the conditions were vastly different from the contested skies of Western Europe. In the early months of the campaign, German aircraft faced limited resistance from Soviet air defenses. Once again, the Stuka could operate in the environment for which it had been designed: a battlefield where German forces dominated the air. The aircraft returned to its role as flying artillery. As German armored divisions advanced across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, Stuka squadrons hunted for enemy formations. Columns of Soviet tanks moving along dusty roads suddenly found themselves under attack from the sky. The dive bombers would appear in formation, circle the battlefield, and then plunge downward one after another. The earth would erupt in explosions as bombs struck vehicles and defensive positions. Entire convoys were shattered in minutes. The psychological effect remained immense. Soviet soldiers soon learned to recognize the sound of approaching dive bombers and the horrifying scream that followed as they descended. But the Eastern Front also pushed the Stuka into new roles. German engineers developed specialized versions of the aircraft armed with powerful anti-tank cannons. These variants hunted Soviet armored vehicles across the battlefield, firing armor-piercing rounds capable of destroying even heavy tanks. One of the most famous Stuka pilots was Hans Ulrich Rudel, whose relentless attacks against Soviet armor became legendary within the Luftwaffe. Flying hundreds of missions, Rudel reportedly destroyed large numbers of tanks and vehicles during the war, becoming one of the most decorated pilots in German military history. Yet even on the Eastern Front, the Stuka's era was slowly fading. As Soviet air power recovered and more modern fighters entered the skies, the slow dive bomber again became vulnerable. The aircraft that had once dominated the battlefield was beginning to face a world that was moving faster than it could keep up. Part 6: The machine that could not escape time. By the later years of World War II, the skies had changed dramatically. The war that began with the terrifying scream of the Stuka had evolved into a contest dominated by faster, more powerful aircraft. Allied fighters roamed the skies in growing numbers, and the slow dive bomber increasingly struggled to survive in this new environment. Technology was advancing rapidly. Fighter aircraft were becoming faster and more heavily armed. Radar-guided defenses improved. Anti-aircraft guns became deadlier. In this new battlefield, the Stuka's weaknesses were impossible to hide. The aircraft that once symbolized German air power now required heavy fighter escort simply to reach its target. Without protection, it could be destroyed in moments by enemy fighters. German commanders began replacing the Stuka with newer aircraft capable of carrying bombs while also defending themselves in combat. Yet despite these changes, the Stuka refused to disappear entirely. On quieter sectors of the front, especially in the east, it continued to perform ground attack missions where enemy air defenses were weaker. Even as the war turned against Germany, the aircraft remained a symbol of an earlier phase of the conflict. Its design reflected a moment in military history when precision dive bombing had seemed revolutionary. By 1944 and 1945, however, the world had moved on. Faster fighter bombers, rockets, and new tactics began to dominate the battlefield. The Stuka was no longer the terror of the sky. It had become a relic of a strategy that could no longer win the war. Part 7 at the echo of the siren. War leaves behind many sounds. The thunder of artillery. The roar of engines. The silence that follows destruction. But among these echoes, few were as haunting as the scream of the Stuka. For soldiers who fought beneath it, the Jericho Trumpets became a symbol of fear that arrived from the sky without warning. The sound was designed to break morale, to shake the human mind before the bomb even struck the ground. Yet the story of the Stuka is more than the story of a weapon. It is the story of a moment in history when technology and psychology merged into a single instrument of war. The aircraft represented a terrifying new way of fighting, one where speed, precision, and fear were used together to overwhelm an enemy. For a time, the strategy worked. The Stuka helped open the road for German armies across Europe. Its attacks shaped some of the most dramatic early battles of World War II. Entire campaigns unfolded beneath the shadow of its wings. But war does not remain static. Every weapon eventually meets its counter. The Stuka, once unstoppable, became vulnerable as air defenses improved and enemy fighters filled the skies. In the end, the aircraft that had once ruled the battlefield faded into history, replaced by faster and more versatile machines. Yet the memory remains. Because in the dark skies of the early war, when the dive bombers appeared high above the battlefield and began their terrible descent, there was a moment just before the bombs fell when all that could be heard was the wind. And then came the scream.